time here. I love Indianapolis. I'm a Midwest girl. I enjoy spending time here. A lot of people like to get away from the cold. I don't really mind it as much. And also,
what if the biggest story in basketball wasn't a fairy tale, but a fuse already burning? Everyone sees the celebrations, the packed stadiums, and the record-shattering ratings surrounding Caitlin Clark. But a recently leaked audio clip, music, from inside the Indiana Fever's private training sessions hints that something dangerous is building beneath the surface. Music, and the very teammates sharing her locker room might be the ones lighting the fuse. This is not the story the mainstream media is rushing to tell. This is the story of what unfolds when a revolution, powered by a single player, threatens to swallow everyone standing beside her. And the murmurs of bitterness are beginning to drown out the applause. The hysteria surrounding Caitlin Clark's arrival into the WNBA isn't simply large. It's a geological shift that has permanently altered the entire terrain of women's athletics. We're not talking about an ordinary rookie stepping onto a roster. We are watching the entrance of a cultural force, a living, breathing media empire whose slightest action generates millions of dollars and attracts audiences who had never once thought about tuning into a WNBA game. Her final college appearances drew an astonishing 18.7 million viewers, a figure that towers over the audiences for the World Series and the NBA Finals. That's not merely talent. That's a cultural earthquake, a lightning-in-a-bottle moment that every franchise in professional sports spends decades desperately chasing. And with that earthquake comes a crushing burden of expectation that would shatter an ordinary athlete. A pressure so overwhelming, it can tear apart the very foundation of a team. Before she ever played a single minute of professional basketball, she signed a Nike deal reportedly valued at a staggering $28 million. Take a moment to truly absorb that. This one contract for a single rookie, music, exceeds the total payroll of multiple WNBA franchises put together. It was a deal that came with a signature shoe, a distinction reserved exclusively for the most extraordinary and generation-defining athletes walking the planet. And the momentum didn't slow there. Partnerships with powerhouses like Gatorade, State Farm, and Panini poured in rapidly, constructing a financial empire the league had never come close to witnessing before. When the Fever secured the draft lottery, they didn't simply claim the first selection. They claimed a golden ticket, a direct pass to unimaginable visibility and financial stability. Ticket demand, which had previously been a constant uphill battle, exploded so dramatically that rival franchises began relocating their home matchups against the Fever into full-sized NBA venues just to handle the overflow. Their games were yanked immediately from obscure streaming platforms and planted into prime national broadcast windows on ESPN and ABC. The franchise, once barely an afterthought in the music league, became overnight the absolute center of the basketball universe. But this golden music ticket carried hidden conditions. A concealed price that the organization is only now beginning to fully reckon with. The coming of a messiah demands that the existing order be dismantled. And for the athletes already in Indiana Fever uniforms, this seismic disruption felt far less like salvation and far more like an unwelcome occupation. And that is precisely where the first hairline fractures in the structure began to form. Before the tsunami of Clark mania crashed into Indianapolis, the Fever already possessed a spirit and an identity. They had a team, music, a core of battle-hardened and supremely gifted professionals who had spent years grinding, clawing for every scrap of recognition in a league that constantly fights for mainstream relevance. Standing at the absolute heart of that core music was Aliyah Boston, the prior year's #1 overall selection and the unanimous, uncontested Rookie of the Year. Boston was supposed to represent the future of the franchise, a commanding, imposing presence in the paint around whom the organization would construct its dynasty for the coming decade. She was the cornerstone, the player who gave the fan base genuine belief after a prolonged stretch of gut-wrenching losing seasons. Standing alongside her were proven veterans like Kelsey Mitchell, music, an explosively fast scorer who had served as the team's offensive engine for years, and Alyssa Smith, another high-profile draft selection carrying undeniable all-star potential. These were not reserves warming the bench. These were elite competitors, the load-bearing pillars of the entire organization. They were the ones who performed in front of half-empty seats, who battled for every basket, and who genuinely believed they were only a few additions away from turning things around and contending seriously for a title. They had a system, a culture, and a well-established hierarchy. Then, without warning, all of it was wiped away. In an instant, they were no longer the Indiana Fever. They were Caitlin Clark's supporting cast. Every interview request, every broadcast segment, every SportsCenter highlight existed solely to discuss the rookie. The players who had given everything to this franchise were reduced to background characters in a story they never agreed to be a part of. Imagine the deep, gnawing sting of that invisibility. You are a professional athlete performing at the absolute pinnacle of your abilities, an all-star, a rookie of the music year. And in a single night, you become a minor character in someone else's headline. Music. A quiet, smoldering resentment began building inside the locker room. A hazardous undercurrent flowing just beneath the polished surface of the team's public press appearances. Music. It wasn't a matter of personally despising Caitlin Clark. It was about the total and systematic erasure of the identities they had spent years earning. But that smoldering resentment buried inside the locker room was about to find a very real, and some would argue deeply troubling, expression on the practice floor. The leap from college basketball to the professional level is never a gentle one. The pace is quicker, the bodies are stronger, more explosive, and the competition is absolutely unforgiving. Every rookie receives a welcome to the league moment. Music, a physical wake-up call reminding them they are no longer untouchable. But what was emerging from the Fever's training camp felt like something altogether more deliberate. It wasn't simply a moment. It was a deliberate and sustained operation. Reports began seeping out from witnesses and team insiders that the practice sessions were unusually ferocious, almost disturbingly savage. And the focal point of this ferocity appeared to be one singular target: Caitlin Clark. She was being hunted, shoved, bodied, music, and physically tested on every single possession. Whether she was handling the ball or standing away from it. Veterans weren't simply guarding her. They were delivering a clear and painful declaration. A screen felt less like a tactical basketball action and more like a full-body collision. A box out carried an extra elbow, a touch more aggression than the situation required. These weren't random, isolated plays. They were calculated power moves. It was a collective effort to demonstrate to the phenomenon that her college highlight reel, music, her record-shattering statistics, and her multi-million-dollar brand partnerships counted for absolutely nothing inside these walls. This was their house, their league, and she would be forced to earn every last inch of respect through suffering and sheer willpower. Music. The official narrative coming from the organization was that they were simply preparing her for the brutal physicality of the WNBA, hardening her for the wars that lay ahead. But most observers recognized it for exactly what it was. A coordinated campaign of intimidation against the rookie, a calculated attempt to cut her down to size, to fracture her confidence before the season even had a chance to begin. The very athletes who were supposed to welcome her as a new teammate were performing music, like sworn enemies, fueled by a rage that seemed to stretch far beyond ordinary competitive fire. The polished smiles staged for cameras had vanished entirely, replaced by snarls and a degree of physical aggression that felt deeply personal. And what came to light next, exposed through the coach's own incriminating words, would validate every fear people had quietly been harboring. Every championship-caliber organization needs a leader, a coach capable of steering through the treacherous currents of professional egos and forging a unified, battle-ready group. For the Indiana Fever, that responsibility belongs to Christy Sides. Music. And she currently occupies the most punishing, most thankless seat of any head coach in the entire WNBA. Her responsibilities can no longer be reduced to designing plays and managing lineup decisions. She is now in the business of containing a locker room that is on the verge of detonating, an internal civil war that threatens to consume the entire franchise from the inside out. On one side of the equation, she possesses a generational talent in Caitlin Clark. A player capable of single-handedly filling arenas to capacity, commanding national headlines, and deciding games on her own. The rational decision, the decision being demanded by the front office, the league itself, and the millions of newly converted fans, is to place the entire operation in her hands. Structure the complete offensive system around her extraordinary range and her elite-level court vision and playmaking. Music. But on the opposing side of that equation, she holds a locker room packed with proud, accomplished veterans, including a reigning Rookie of the Year in Aliyah Boston, who feel they are being discarded and stripped of their dignity. Music. If Side surrenders completely to Clark's star power, she risks severing her relationship with the rest of the roster entirely, manufacturing music, a suffocating atmosphere of envy and bitterness that could contaminate the entire season from top to bottom. If she instead attempts to handle Clark as any other unproven rookie, demanding that she pay her dues the hard way, she risks suppressing the very talent that could deliver them a championship and alienating the enormous new audience that now represents the financial oxygen of the franchise. It is a razor's edge, a tightrope strung impossibly high with no net waiting below. Every decision she commits to, every substitution she makes, every word she speaks publicly is analyzed and torn apart. Every play she designs is read as either blatant favoritism or a quiet message of disapproval. She must project an airtight image of solidarity and harmony to the outside world while privately wrestling with the spreading fractures threatening to split her team down the middle. Her statements to the press have been meticulously constructed. Music, packed with hollow coaching platitudes about healthy competition and the ongoing process of building team chemistry. But it was one unfiltered comment, one unguarded slip that exposed the unbearable strain she was carrying, that blew the entire situation wide open for the world to examine. This is the precise moment when quiet whispers transformed into an overwhelming, deafening roar. The leaked audio clip didn't originate from a concealed hot microphone or a covert recording made by a bitter team employee. In many respects, it carried far greater weight precisely because it was spoken openly, on the record, with full awareness that the world was listening. During a standard media availability session, Coach Christy Sides was posed a question about Clark's transition into professional basketball. Rather than retreating behind a polished, rehearsed response, she said something that sent immediate tremors throughout the entire league and confirmed the darkest suspicions many had already been carrying. She acknowledged, without hesitation, that Clark had been getting a little beat up in practice. Music. It was a breathtaking and nearly incomprehensible admission. A head coach does not simply volunteer the information that their franchise centerpiece, the new public face of the league and their organization's most valuable asset, is being physically punished by the very teammates surrounding her. The phrase, beat up, is not chosen carelessly. It is not the kind of language you reach for without intention. It carries implications that stretch far beyond routine competitive contact. It suggests something targeted, deliberate, and relentlessly sustained. This was not simply a demanding practice session. This was a gauntlet, a punishing physical trial designed to test every limit. Sides was essentially corroborating the rumors that the veterans were pursuing Clark with a calculated and collective vengeance. But then, the situation deteriorated even further. Other players began to open their mouths and their words, once decoded and placed within proper context, sketched an even bleaker portrait of the dysfunction eating away at the team from within. When pressed about Clark, one veteran offered that, "This isn't college anymore. And that respect is something you earn through action, not something handed to you by reputation." On the surface, it registers as a predictable sports platitude. But positioned against the backdrop of those brutal practice reports and the coach's own damaging admission, it landed as a direct and deliberate strike. It was a public declaration that Clark, regardless of her celebrity and her fortune, was being placed at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy, music, and would be required to scratch and claw for every ounce of standing she hoped to claim. These soundbites, assembled together and examined as a whole, lay bare the raw, unvarnished truth. The simmering fury wasn't simply a conspiracy theory manufactured in online fan communities. It was genuine. The team was not a warm, welcoming family embracing its newest star. It was a fractured and divided unit, and the battle lines were being etched deeper into the practice floor with every single passing day. Once you develop the ability to recognize what you're actually looking at, the evidence of this deeply embedded tension becomes impossible to miss. It lives in the small details, the fleeting unscripted moments tucked between the action that expose the reality hiding just beneath the carefully managed public surface. Study the bench during a live game. You will observe a visible and uncomfortable distance, an absence of the effortless, organic camaraderie that defines genuinely championship-caliber organizations. When Clark produces a spectacular play, the response from certain teammates registers as mechanical, arriving half a beat too slow, feeling more like a contractual obligation than an authentic, shared eruption of joy. The high fives appear hollow, the smiles visibly strained. In the post-game interview room, the body language grows even more revealing. Music, Players settle into their seats with arms folded tightly across their chests, a classically defensive posture, dispensing short, clipped, carefully minimized answers whenever team chemistry is raised as a subject. The word "I" surfaces far more frequently than the word "we." When a reporter redirects a question about Clark toward one of her teammates, you can catch a barely concealed flash of irritation, a subtle music, tightening along the jawline, before they produce the polished, media-coached answer about how wonderful it is to share the floor with her. The official narrative being sold to the public is one of absolute unity and collective enthusiasm. The reality beneath that narrative appears to be a collection of individual professionals sharing a music court, but not a shared mission, not a common purpose, not a genuine bond. Team insiders have begun feeding additional details to outside sources, doing so under the protection of anonymity out of legitimate fear of professional consequences. Music. They describe a locker room thick with silence and unspoken tension, with distinct factions solidifying between the veteran core and the newer arrivals. They paint a picture of an atmosphere that crackles with unaddressed hostility, an unspoken but universally understood reality that the team has effectively split into two distinct camps: Team Clark and everyone who exists outside of that orbit. This has moved well beyond the ordinary friction of a roster integrating a new personality. This is a fundamental collision of two entirely incompatible cultures, a raw power struggle unfolding in plain sight for anyone willing to look honestly. The organization is working overtime to project an exterior of cohesion and positivity, but the fractures running through the foundation have grown too deep and too wide for any amount of public relations management to conceal. And the force behind this internal earthquake is something infinitely more combustible and divisive than basketball itself. Money. Let's strip away every layer of politeness and speak with absolute honesty for a moment. The true origin of this conflict, the real and unspoken fuel feeding the fire burning inside the Indiana Fever locker room, traces back to a single source: cold, hard, undeniable cash. And the gap between what exists on one side and the other is so enormous, so staggering in its disparity, that it nearly defies rational comprehension. Caitlin Clark's Nike contract is reportedly structured at $28 million across 8 years. That calculates to an average annual payout of $3.5 million from a single brand partnership alone. Now hold that figure next to the salary realities facing her veteran teammates. The Supermax contract in the WNBA, the absolute ceiling available to the most decorated and established stars the league has to offer, sits at approximately $240,000 annually. Numerous seasoned veterans, women who have earned all-star selections and invested years building this league with their bodies and their careers, bring home considerably less than that figure, with some falling below 6 figures entirely. What this means in plain terms is that Caitlin Clark is generating more than 10 times the annual income of her highest-earning teammate from a single endorsement arrangement alone. Her cumulative earnings across all brand partnerships dwarf the combined total salary cap of her own franchise. Place yourself inside Aliyah Boston's reality for a moment. You were selected first overall. You were crowned Rookie of the Year. You carried this team through dark and desperate seasons and gave an entire city a reason to believe again. Your WNBA salary sits below $80,000. And then a new player enters the building, and before she has demonstrated the ability to perform consistently at this level night after night, she is already a multimillionaire by a staggering margin. The media does not merely spotlight her above you. They erase you from the frame entirely. Every sold-out seat, every